Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com. And the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Subscriptions available at bakerstreetjournal.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 113, Dancing to Death.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street Irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Welcome once again to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
And I'm Burt Wolder.
And we are back after our Anno Holmes 130 celebration. I'm still wiping the frosting from the birthday cake off of my chin. And I only had to undo my belt buckle one notch instead of two this year, so that's a victory.
Oh, that is a victory! What a great week, and what a great weekend, and such happy memories, you know. Yeah. Again, you know, and I don't want to dwell on this too much, but part of this great hobby is spending time with like-minded people and talking about whatever it is that comes to mind. If some of it happens to be Sherlockian, great. If it's catching up on each other's families or career or developments, whatever, it's just nice to spend time with like-minded people. Yeah, it sure is.
Indeed.
And we had some great conversations. You know, I was remembering our conversations with Matthias, who was there from over the river, and
and we'll be talking to him later in the year. We'll have him on the show, talk about his book. Yeah. Books, really.
Books, yeah. And Steve Mason, we spent some time with Steve Mason, and Constantine Kakis, who was from Edmonton. All these people sort of came back to me when I was thinking about the weekend this morning. Great.
Yeah. And stay tuned, because Steve Mason will figure prominently in a new feature on ihearofsherlock.com on the website, where we will be sharing some of the original elementary cartoons with you.
Yeah.
Steve and his son Rusty have a wonderful little production there through their Sherlockian scion down in Texas. Is it the Lone Star crew of the Bark
Lone Star? Yeah.
Yeah, they've been producing a comic there for a while, and we are going to be syndicating it on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, we love content.
We do. And speaking of content, you know who does great content?
I can't imagine who.
Why, Wessex Press.
Friends, we in the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex are working to secure our border with Mercia. We're building a wall. Unfortunately, some people in Chippenham grouse about needing a passport to go to Gloucester. They are small-minded. But thankfully, you have wide interests. You're curious about the architecture of Yoxley Old Place from the Golden Pince-Nez. You question the plot of The Problem of Thor Bridge. You wonder about Sherlock Holmes and the Ripper murders. That's why you cherish your copy of Unmitigated Bleat, selected writings by Paul D. Herbert, and marvel that its 221 pages are a mere $19.95. Friends, it's February, when around above the world of snow, the light-heeled breezes breathe and blow. It's the perfect time for introspection, and for the pleasure only a volume from the Wessex Press can provide. Choose yours today.
I love coming back from Wessex.
I do too. You know, the peat smell is just in your nostrils. You feel so refreshed from that English countryside.
Oh, is that what it is on my shoes? My wife made me take them off at the door. She thought it was something else entirely.
Oh, what a critic.
Well, now that we are back from the bucolic setting of Wessex, why don't we get ready for our guest to come on board? Won't you do the honors, Bert?
Oh, thank you. We're very pleased today to be joined by Ray Betzner, BSI. Ray is Associate Vice President for Executive Communications at Temple University in Philadelphia. He is a native of Pittsburgh. He is a longstanding irregular. He's a member of has been a member of the Scion of Four, a lovely name, in Morgantown, West Virginia. Was co-founder of the Cremona Fiddlers of Williamsburg. Currently, he is controller of the kennel for the Sons of the Copper Beeches in Philadelphia. In 1987, he was invested in the BSI as the Agony Column. He is a Morley Montgomery Award winner, and to celebrate the 75th anniversary of Vincent Starrett's The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, Ray edited a new edition for the Wessex Press. He is a speaker and authority about Starrett and blogs about him at vincentstarrett.com, and we welcome you. Hi, Ray.
Hey, Bert. Great to be here.
Well, and I suppose we should, before we even talk about this opus, let's talk a little bit about Vincent Starrett just for a second or two.
I'd love that. Yes,
because
absolutely.
That's such a defining characteristic of you and your interests. How did you first, of all the, I'm just fascinated because of all the different ways people get into and find associations in things Sherlockian. Some follow the trail of Morley, some follow the trail of Edgar Smith, some follow the stories, some follow the movies. How did Starrett first loom large for you?
So I had read the Sherlock Holmes stories probably first when I was 8 or 9 years old. But when I was 16, after having gotten my driver's license, after failing the first 2 times I took the test, I went to the local public library outside of McKeesport, Pennsylvania, and went looking for Sherlock Holmes books. And they had 2. One was the Doubleday edition with Christopher Morley's introduction to it. And the other was a reprint of the 1960 edition of The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. And it was in the back of that book, back of Vincent Starrett's book, that I first read about a group called the Baker Street Irregulars. Huh. And, as a teen sitting there reading about these wits who gathered in New York once a year, it felt like I was reading about a group of gods who got together and had a riotous time once a year in Valhalla. It really was it just seemed kind of a completely a foreign territory for me. And I always thought well of Vincent Starrett for essentially introducing me to that world. So many years later, I was a college student and West Virginia University in Morgantown, West Virginia, and the local prosecuting attorney there, a guy by the name of Andrew G. Fusco, was head of the Scion of the Four in Morgantown, and Andy allowed himself to be interviewed by a gangly, jean-clad reporter for the student newspaper. He said he could give me 20 minutes, and 2 hours later he looked at me and he said, I think you've got what it takes. We're going to invite you to our next meeting of the Sign of the Four, and it went on from there. I kept coming back to Starrett over the years, and about 20 years ago, I was talking with a dear friend of mine, the late Chuck Henry, who was the Lions Mate in the BSI. And Chuck hauled out probably about half dozen Starrett books that were not about Holmes, but about various other subjects, especially about book collecting, and handed them to me, and he said, I think you'll like these. And it went on from there. I was a newspaper reporter for the first 10 years of my life. Starrett, of course, started his life as a newspaper reporter too, so we had that in common. And he loved books. And the way he wrote about books and collecting books just touched the romantic in my soul. So I thought of him as a guide and a kinsman, and became absolutely fascinated by him and his life and his writings, and have never stopped. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, we could probably dedicate an entire podcast series to Vincent Starrett if we wanted to, much like your blog.
Yeah.
But why don't we get to our subject here, Dancing to Death?
Yes.
The Manuscript series is fairly well known. We've talked about it a good deal here on the show. What made you and David the right editors for this? Did you approach the team? Did they approach you? And how did it come about?
So earlier I had mentioned that Andy Fusco had been very influential in my becoming a member of the Baker Street Irregulars and my interest in Sherlock Holmes and irregularity. And it was Andy who came to me a little over a year ago and asked if I would be interested in doing the one of the books in the Manuscript series. And it was a very intriguing offer. It was also a little intimidating. Bob Katz and Andy Sahlberg have done such an amazing job with the last several books in this series. It was intimidating to think of following in their footsteps. I knew that if I was going to do it, I was going to need help, and so I asked an old friend of mine, Dave Morrill, whom I've known for 30 years, and we've worked on projects together in the past, if he would be willing to do it. He said yes, and so I told Andy we were in, and so that's how it came about. There was one other factor, Scott, that was vitally important. I don't know of many people who have sat down with even a reproduction of a Arthur Conan Doyle manuscript and transcribed it start to finish. You become very intimately involved in the elements of the story, in Conan Doyle's writing, the background and history of the story. And I thought to myself, rather selfishly perhaps, that was absolutely something that I wanted to do. So in addition to putting together the list of contributors and overseeing the publication of the book, I did the transcription too. Got in a little over my head, thank God. Phil Burgum came to the rescue and came in and very, very graciously agreed to help out somebody who was a little at sea, and so we share credit on the transcription. But imagine, each and every word of a Sherlock Holmes story, spending a little time with it. Is this the right word? Is this the word he really means here? What changes did he make along the way? You often don't have that opportunity. Only a handful of people really have. So I count myself very, very fortunate.
Yeah. Now, was this a manuscript that you had physically seen or handled before?
Ooh, no. And the history of the manuscript itself is actually a fascinating one. It's very different than the other manuscripts that have been done in this series, and it has its own mystery associated with it. So here's a bit of how kind of it came about to be part of the series. Don Hobbs, whom you've had on previous podcasts, as you know, lives in Fort Worth, Texas, and he became friends with a book dealer there by the name of Brian Perkins. Perkins, after several years, says to Don, come with me. They go zigzagging through Fort Worth, and as Don says it, he got a key to one of the boxes at the basement of a bank. He opened the box, handed me the withdrawn contents. I looked down at a custom-made dark blue binder with gold embossed letters. The title leapt out, and it was like being slapped in the face. I was holding the original handwritten manuscript of The Adventure of the Dancing Men. For once in my life, I was left speechless.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Don was the one who kind of brings this to the attention of Mike Keene, who, as you know, has been very involved with the publishing arm of the BSI, and eventually they all work it out so that the manuscript is scanned, and that's what I received in the mail from John Berquist about a year ago.
Hmm. And for those folks who haven't seen one of these books, we should tell you that's what you have here. You have a 206-page hardcover book, about 10 by 7, that has a front section, past the usual introductions and things like that reproduces on the right-hand side of the page those actual manuscript pages. And when Ray and talks about the transcription and talks about the work that he and Phil did, on the left-hand side of the page, you have the typed version of what you're seeing on the right-hand side of the page, with all of the author's changes and the words scratched out, represented on the left-hand side of the page. And that's really a big part of the magic of this. Not only do you get to see what the manuscript looked like and what the handwriting looked like, but you could see the writing process sort of in process and what stayed and what law. And there are notes in here about, this page seems like it was added later, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of discovery that goes on in that. And then we'll talk about this later, but after the manuscript, there are a series of fascinating essays on a whole bunch of different topics related to the story.
Absolutely right. So, again, how many people have the opportunity to do this? Not many. And it was a tremendous opportunity. I really loved it, and would also never do it again.
So how long did all this take? I mean, you say in your introduction, which has, I think, an April date on it, that you've been working on it for half a year. So when I get out my steam-driven calculator, I can sort of. So this is a big commitment of time.
It is. So some parts were much easier than others, Bert. The call to various individuals and asking them to write something for this volume was actually pretty easy. David and I talked about it, and who we'd like to have involved in the volume, and the list pretty quickly came about. So. That call went out, and almost everyone said yes, and almost everyone said that they could do it in a relatively short period of time, which is all I gave them. And the contributions were wonderful. Sitting down and every evening transcribing 3 or 4 or maybe 5 pages on a good night, that takes quite a while. You have to not only pay attention to what it is that's on the page, you have to go back and take a look at Conan Doyle's handwriting, which is generally pretty good, certainly a heck of a lot better than Vincent Starrett's, but there are still places where you puzzle over a squiggle and can't quite figure out exactly what word that is supposed to be. Phil is much better at that than I am, I admit it. And then there are delightful surprises along the way that come up as you're doing that, and they just cause you to kind of sit back and say, wow, that's I didn't know that. I didn't know that, for example, Hilton Cubitt started out with the potential name of John Jones. Sort of the Ormond Sacker of the
possibly
of
the most ordinary name ever to flow from Conan Doyle's pen, John Jones.
Yeah. Well,
Culverton Smith.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's two references in the manuscript to Hilton Jones before he became later Hilton Cubitt. And then in Shades of Mary Morstan, Hilton's wife calls him John rather than Hilton. So, there's this name confusion going on there that of course doesn't show up in the final product. But you also get, the manuscript is fun for other reasons too. Conan Doyle was you've already read about how clearly he had in mind the elements of the story and how he makes very few changes along the way. Well, a couple of significant changes that he made in this manuscript, when it came to the scene where both Cubitt and his wife are shot, he describes the clothing that they're wearing, and then he scratches that out, and he describes the clothing that they're wearing again, with changes in it, and then he scratches that out, and then he just kind of bypasses the whole thing. So he clearly had, kind of a scene in mind that he was visualizing, but later on in the writing process didn't like it, went back, rewrote it, didn't like it again, and kept playing with it as the writing process went on. So, that's fun to watch take place as you read through the manuscript. And then there are these lovely elements in there, the whole business of these names that are dropped in this story that never show up again, like Thurston. You
right.
Thurston, of course.
Yes, yes. His Watson's billiard partner.
Exactly.
Right.
Who tried to get him to invest in some foreign investments, and then William Hargrave. William Hargrave, pops up as a name. Holmes is the one has sent him a cable. He's trying to verify some information regarding the villain of the piece, and Hargrave, name that's mentioned and then disappears. You never find out what the Wilson Hargrave. That's right. You never find out. You never hear that name again, which is why I can't get the first name right.
Now, looking at the book, there's the manuscript, and then there are 10 essays.
Yes.
And you might expect, as you do, find that with the curious circumstances of the lost manuscript about which the book is based, that there would be an essay or two about that. And in fact, we encounter Randall Scott's remarks about the history of the manuscript and so on. And Don Hobbs, as you say, has a lovely little piece about his interactions and intersections with the manuscript. And then, since, ciphers and codes are a big part of the story, there are 2 terrific essays by Donnie Zalden and Dana Richards on, first, the cipher in The Dancing Men, in which Donnie reviews the sources and Dana does the whole swath of codes and ciphers in the canon. How did you decide on the topics to be addressed? How did you figure? So those things seem pretty logical. The rest are well, they're all interesting, but the rest are really different in some cases. And I'm just curious how you went about that. How did that happen?
Well, some of them just popped up. Peggy Perdue pointed out to me that Donnie Zalden had been working on the sources of the Dancing Men for years and had been writing about the topic. And so it seemed a natural thing just to go to him and say, this is your opportunity to pull it all together into one place in kind of permanent binding. So that was a natural kind of thing to have happen. Dana, whom I've known for a number of years, actually it was Mike Whalen who recommended Dana do a piece about ciphers because that's part of what Dana does as a living. And he readily agreed to go ahead and write something up. So, kind of matching someone's natural interest or profession with a topic was actually pretty easy in those cases. David Morrill has had a long history and interest in adaptations of the Sherlock Holmes stories for screen and for television. So he took a look at the Granada production and analyzed that in detail. I wanted to blend kind of some seasoned Sherlockians with some of the folks who are newer on the scene. So both Tim Greer and Ashley Polasek, who are a little bit more recent to the Sherlock Holmes world, both came at the topic with fresh eyes and did extraordinary pieces for us. Tim writing about the importance of sound in the Adventure of the Dancing Men and how sound is still used in both preventing and fighting crime today. Ashley Polasek did an absolutely amazing job going back through a lot of years of commentary and putting it all together into one place. She looked at a number of issues. For example, did Hilton Cubitt's wife, was she completely innocent in all of this, or was she actually the brains behind the whole operation and managed to find herself a rich country squire, get rid of him, inherit his property, and live happily ever after? So, yeah.
It's such a suspicious world, isn't it?
It is indeed. It is indeed. But, so I there was one thing I wanted to bring up about the story itself, and I don't know how the two of you feel about it, but I have to admit I've always had misgivings about Dancing Men because Holmes's client dies. Mm-hmm. And he seems not terribly upset about that, in fact. He is very, very concerned about solving the cryptogram. And, he spends a lot of time with it. He sits there and he whistles and sings as he is playing with the various characters in the cryptogram. I don't remember Holmes whistling and singing very often in the canon. So he's clearly delighted by the fact that he has this problem in front of him. He sends some cables off to the United States, and then he doesn't do anything for a few days while he waits for those cables to come back, for the responses to come back. And it's during that time, of course, that his client is murdered. There have been a few folks who have said that he bears some responsibility for the death of Hilton Cubitt. And I have to say I agree. He could have acted sooner based on everything that he knew, but he didn't. And so the story has always been a little off for me, not one of my favorites because of that.
Mm. Well, I think that's a very fair comment. I have a very similar feeling. One of the nice things that the book, Dancing to Death, includes in one of the essays is a mention of the regression analysis that was done by applying various factors to components of the Sherlockian literature. And based on that regression analysis, and then based on lots of other things, based on Conan Doyle's own personal list, the book points out that Dancing Men has always been a top-ranked Sherlock Holmes story. Now, the code, the cipher, is so attractive. It was even emulated in one of the Rathbone Bruce films, and that is clearly very distinctive, like the Lost Crown of the Stuarts and the Musgrave Ritual, and like the Great Agra Treasure. The MacGuffin. It's a great MacGuffin, but for all the reasons you mention, it's not a story that I turn to frequently and say, "Oh boy, let's reread the Dancing Men."
Yeah.
No, I mean, if anything, it's probably the most tragic of all of the stories, and not solely because Holmes bears responsibility, but because it was this wonderful love story. Hilton Cubitt was, really dedicated to Elsie. This is a man who, waited to marry and, finally found the love of his life, and little did he know these deep, dark secrets that she brought with her, and only to end in such a tragic way. And, I think in David's retelling of the Granada production, I think this was one of the strongest episodes that Granada did. And I think they captured that love story, and they captured the tragedy. When Mrs. Cubitt finally takes the gun and turns it on herself, she is really at, the ultimate despair.
I think you're right, Scott. The intriguing part about all of that, though, is that you have here a story that it is really designed around the puzzle and not around the people. The adaptation really brings that forward, but for Holmes especially, this is the justification for his give me cryptograms and puzzles and I'll be happy kind of affair. And so it's Watson who talks in loving almost terms about the death of Cubitt and who feels that relationship between him and Elsie. But as Mike Burdan points out in the essay that he does in the book, if Cubitt had pressed his wife just a little bit harder, he might have been able to get her to acknowledge what was really going on here, and saved all of their lives. But this is one of those cases where he absolutely refuses to pursue this issue with his wife, and as a result, dies because of it.
Yeah.
I love the title on Mike's essay. What you don't know can kill you. colon, the frequently unpleasant consequences of spousal secrets in the canon.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. This isn't the only case where that kind of thing happens, but this is probably the case where it has the deadliest consequences.
Yeah. Now, before we get too far away from the cipher, Bert and I, in preparation for our other show that we just started called Trifles. If you haven't tuned into Trifles yet, check it out at SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. We were looking through the BSI dinner packet, and we found a piece that was submitted by Marino Alvarez for the dinner. It was called Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Cipher. And I remember hearing about this pin cipher, and I believe it was in the Vincent Price introduction to the Granada airing on PBS. And Marino talks about how Conan Doyle was involved in espionage during World War I. And he reported it during a convention, the Stoll Convention dinner that was held in the Balmoral Ballroom of the Trocadero on the 28th of September, 1921. He revealed how he used a method used years ago by Tacitus to communicate with a friend who was a prisoner of war by employing pinpricks underneath letters of his stories. Mm-hmm. And I quote Conan Doyle here, who said, "My creation of Holmes did, after all, a small bit of war work. It's hardly worth mentioning, but I had a friend who was shut up in a Magdeburg military prison in Germany, and he and his brother officers were getting no news from England. So I took a volume of Sherlock Holmes, and in it I pricked out all of the newsletter by letter, beginning with the 3rd chapter. Pricking under each letter of the message with a needle, I sent the book to him with a note saying, 'This may relive your prison captivity and afterwards may be placed in the prison library. It is slow, but perhaps you might find the 3rd chapter to be a little more interesting.' I thought it would be good enough for him, but as a matter of fact, he missed it. There was, however, another officer, Captain the Honorable Keppel of the Guards, who, with extraordinary sagacity, got onto it. The result was that the British officers in captivity got the whole of the news of England at that time. I then got another letter saying, 'Please send us another Sherlock Holmes story.' I continued to send them all news pricked out in them to those officers until I learned that they were actually being allowed to have English newspapers, and then I desisted." So that's Conan Doyle's tale of using a cipher as well. But this is typical, and we saw this in in one of the recent episodes of Sherlock, where he waited until the 3rd chapter. He didn't do it in the first chapters because he thought that, well, if there were guards or if the enemy was searching for something, they would search in the first 2 chapters and then give up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's fascinating, how, particularly in those days, it's pointed out, I think, in Dana's article, how long, you just mentioned, back to the classical era, ciphers and codes have been employed, but how frequently they tend to attract literary people, not only as devices and stories, but as you point out, actual put it to work and see if we can send some messages to someone who can't get them out in the clear.
Yeah. In Marino's piece, he has a footnote that says, "How to Survive Under Siege is the oldest military handbook to survive from classical antiquity. It's the only surviving work of the 4th century BC from the author Aeneas Tacitus, whom other ancient authors tell us wrote several military handbooks and believed to have been some of the the Arcadian general Aeneas of Stymphalus, who fought in the Battle of Manatea in 362 BC. So this goes way back. And once again, Holmes's quote in this very story, what one man can invent, another can discover.
Yes, that is a nice quote.
The thrill of the chase.
Yeah. There are some nice moments in this story. It begins in Baker Street, which is where we want it to start. There's the mind reading episode. You get a client who comes rushing in through the door who's clearly perplexed and desperate for help. So it starts in a way that you want every Sherlock Holmes story to start.
That's a good point. That formulaic. It sounds a little cliched, but boy, there's a certain level of comfort and hominess in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one of the learnings for me was the origin of the Dancing Men, because either I'd forgotten it or more likely never knew, or probably maybe a little of both. The roots between that particular cipher design and real life, and it traces back in a big way to an autograph book that was in the possession of a young child named Cubitt at a house in Hasbro where Conan Doyle stayed. And to this day, they presume a very strong connection between that house and that book and that child and the Dancing Men cipher.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Although, over the years, there have been other claims made, and I think Donnie goes through them in quite a bit of detail to analyze whether there's any value to them or not. Apparently, these little dancing men figures were far more common than I knew before I started looking at this story. But always attributed to children. And in fact, even in the story, the childish scribblings, they're called. And no one really perceives of them as having any sort of nefarious object until they start showing up at Riddling Thorpe. And suddenly it becomes very, very ominous very fast.
Now, we began the show with strains of Starrett and Chicago, and I thought it was to end that way. One of the essays talks about Chicago and its nefarious reputation in the canon. There's always something shady going on in Chicago.
I don't know why Susan didn't use the title "Toddling Town." But instead she went elsewhere in the lyric and entitled her essay "The Town That Billy Sunday Could Not Shut Down."
On State Street, that great street, I just want to say. Yeah. So what is it with Chicago, Ray?
Yeah. That's a really good question, and no one I thought could answer that better than Susan. I actually asked her specifically to take a look at that question. Susan had lived in Chicago for a while, and so was familiar with the town. And so she does a little analysis and discovers that Chicago, of all the American cities, Chicago is mentioned the most. It's mentioned 42 times in various places in the canon. So it shows up a lot. Oh, and so then she goes through and tries to kind of sort out whether these mentions are positive or negative, and they are predominantly negative. Yeah, so it's 14 of the mentions are absolutely negative beyond the kind of the neutral ones. So there's bad stuff happening in Chicago. And so the question is, why did John Watson and or Conan Doyle believe that Chicago was the place where all evil happens? A lot of the bad guys, a lot of the villains in the Sherlock Holmes canon who are from America at one point or another either have connections with Chicago or pass through Chicago. So it's a bad place. And she gives, I think, a very convincing argument for for some of the reasons why. Chicago even before Prohibition had a reputation for being a tough gangster town, and Prohibition just upped the ante on that during the 20s. So It was the kind of place where crime just seemed to live, and corruption seemed to live. And if you were in England and you wanted to select a town that had resonance of crime and bad guys for your readers, Chicago was the one you needed to pick.
Oh boy! And I think Chicago still maintains that reputation today.
Well, it's. I think Susan did a very nice job in a brief and very lively essay, as she always does. I always love reading her work, and she's a fellow Vincent Starrett fan too.
Yes, I know. We had both of you on the show a couple of years ago.
Indeed.
Yes, episode 61, if I recall correctly.
No, it was a delightful hour. I really enjoyed it. So that's how all of the contributions came about, and I think each one brings something a little different, something unusual that I hope seasoned readers of the Sherlock Holmes canon will find valuable and worthwhile. And altogether, I have to say I'm very pleased with the way it all turned out.
Yeah, I think you should be.
And we are too. This is just a fine representative companion piece to the other Manuscript series volumes that are out there. And I think you've shown that when one takes on a Manuscript editing job, it is clearly a team sport. And Andy and Bob kind of set the tone for that. And having you and David at the helm here, absolutely key to bringing this fine piece to life. So we thank you both.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your interest and your kind words. David clearly had a lot to do with it. Again, a lot of folks out there worked very, very hard on behalf of the volume. And the other thing I want to say is, the folks at Wessex Press do the production on these volumes. They are beautiful books. Mm-hmm. They really are. If you take the dust jacket off of this one, you'll find a nice inscription in gold on the black cover. They are well put together books. The reproduction of the manuscript is crisp and bright and very, very readable. It's just a lovely thing to hold in your hand, and they deserve a lot of credit for that.
Oh. Yeah. Now, where can people go if they want to find out about this and buy a copy for themselves?
If they go to the Baker Street Journal website, they are available for sale there. We had a delightful business on Saturday after the Baker Street Irregulars dinner, and I believe they sold out most of the volumes that they had brought to New York, but there are still more. But as is true with these things, these are short runs. They are limited editions. So if you want one, don't hesitate. Go now.
Yeah, that's true.
Walk, do not run. No, run, do not walk to the nearest laptop or website or a smartphone of your choice. Well, Ray, thank you very much. You're a wonderful storyteller. You're very humble as always when you really don't need to be, and you're a boon to the Sherlockian establishment. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you too for your interest, and thank you for iHose. I've said it a number of times to the two of you, and publicly, even when sober, that I very much enjoy the podcast. I have since its earliest days. It amazes me that you've continued it as long as it has. The quality has up until now been quite high. I'm sure it will quickly fade, but you guys do a great job. It's a lot of fun. I just love listening to each and every episode. Thank you so much for your interest.
If anyone from the Pennsylvania State Home for the Recently Bewildered, one of your outpatients is out tonight, so seek him out.
And off his meds.
Now, well, thank you very much for that, Ray. It's very kind of you to say, and we're glad to do it. We have a lot of fun.
Yes,
you do indeed. You do indeed. It comes across in the final product how much you enjoy yourselves.
What a and always scintillating and pleasant conversation it is with Ray. He did not disappoint.
And he's had such an interesting Sherlockian, everyone we talk to, when we ask them, when did you first meet Sherlock Holmes? And you find out, as Ray told us as an example, that his first, or his other related Sherlockian interests, like Vincent Starrett. And as Ray told us, that he first came to Vincent Starrett because it was almost literally the first book that he reached for was, here's a book, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes, that's interesting. Who's this guy Starrett?
Yeah. We're thankful for people like that have these rabid and varied interests, and in turn interest the rest of us in their passion. That's the wonder of it. It's not just that someone singularly pursues this passion. It's that they pursue it and they share it with others. And you don't have to be a Starrett scholar yourself to be able to appreciate some of the things that Ray ends up surfacing, and it's wonderful. The variety of content, the other publications, the entire genres that Starrett was covering in his column and associated publications. It's another world.
It is.
One of the benefits of this podcast is that we bring you behind the scenes with some of the editors of the many volumes of the Baker Street Irregulars Press. Indeed, you've been treated to one such interview on this very episode. But there's so much more to find than just this particular volume. A quick visit to the Baker Street Journal website finds Out of the Abyss, a facsimile of the manuscript of The Empty House with commentary. G.K. Chesterton's Sherlock Holmes, facsimiles of 19 original unpublished drawings illustrating the Sherlock Holmes canon, together with Chesterton's own writings on Sherlock Holmes and appreciations of Chesterton by leading scholars. Angels of Darkness, a drama in 3 acts, a facsimile edition of a portion of the manuscript and a complete transcript of the previously unpublished manuscript. Together, these form the basis of a fine collection. Individually, they stand as excellent examples of Sherlockian scholarship and an enduring record of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's artistry. Isn't it time you dug deeper than simply reading the Sherlock Holmes stories? Head on over to BakerStreetJournal.com and begin your journey with the BSI Press today.
Friends, how can you protect your privacy when your badly spelled emails are being corrected by Vladimir Putin? That's why coding your messages is important. But how can you remember which knee to raise and where to put the flag when you draw those little dancing men? That's why you need the new Sherlock Holmes brand Codemaster 3000, a powerful new keyboard engineered by BSI cryptographers to instantly code or decode any message. It's the only coding platform that delivers the 3 C's, confidential cryptographic communication. Just write your message in any form. And the Codemaster 3000 does the rest. Elsie, prepare to feed thy goat. Needs work. Available at your local Sherlock Holmes brand retailer today.
Well, please don't be a stranger. Don't you live in another world. Let us know that you're out there. Get in touch with us at, there's a number of ways. How about email? Comment at ihearofsherlock.com. That old-fashioned telephone, whether it's rotary or push button or one of those black mirrors in your hand, punch out the numbers. 774-221-READ. Wait a minute, those aren't numbers. 774-221-7323.
Oh, well done.
Yeah, and of course, I hear of Sherlock on every one of the major social networks that matter.
And even some that don't.
Maybe. And don't forget, if you are a fan of this show, this long-form show, feel free to support us at patreon.com/ihearofsherlock. $1, $2, $3, $5, or $10 an episode or a month, whatever works for you. we are happy to have the support. And even more importantly, this is big. This is big, folks. There's another Sherlock Holmes podcast out there.
What?
Yes.
Good God.
Can you imagine?
Impossible.
Who would be crazy enough to do another Sherlock Holmes podcast?
No one.
Oh, us.
Oh.
What do you know about that? Yes, we have a companion show for those of you that don't like making it through the full hour. And, well, actually, now that we're announcing this at the end of the show, you probably haven't made it through if you don't like making it through the full hour. Well, if you're still with us, regardless, we are doing another show called Trifles, where it's 15 minutes a week. It's a weekly episode, a weekly show. 15 minutes where we talk about some of the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories, discrepancies in dates, in names, parsing apart some of the mysteries, maybe looking at some of the moral and ethical challenges that the characters faced. Lots of different things to ruminate on from within the pages of the Sherlock Holmes stories. So won't you join us over at SherlockHolmesPodcast.com and subscribe to Trifles and let everyone know about it, because it's of broader interest than this crazy little show.
Well, and it's just a different focus, you know, and it's short. And so far, it's a lot of fun, and I think you'll like it.
I hope so. I hope so. But if you don't, you're stuck with us on this program. And until next time, I remain Scott Monty.
And I am remaindered as Bert Wolder.
Do I have to carry the one on that?
No, not because I've introduced rounding, so no, you don't have to. And that goes along with your observation about letting your belt out. So there you are.
Well, there you go. Well, thank goodness you carry the show.
Ooh, ow. I wondered why this was so heavy.
The game's afoot.
You know, I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.
Good evening, I'm Vincent Price, and welcome again to Gory Mansion, where we'll see the third story in the new, and it seems to me, the definitive dramatizations of the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. You know, I'm sure that I am not alone when I invariably visualize the great detective in his famous deerstalker cap and Inverness cape, making his way through foggy London streets, removing his curved meerschaum pipe from his mouth to utter an occasional elementary, "My dear Watson." And yet, that familiar impression, for the most part, is not representative of author Conan Doyle's character. Though they have become part of the Sherlock Holmes lore, they reflect more the concepts of illustrators and dramatic interpreters than they do Doyle's writing. The Sherlock Holmes adventures, like the stories of Charles Dickens, were first published in a magazine, London's legendary Strand magazine. Sidney Paget was the most famous illustrator of the Doyle stories, and he depicted the detective in hundreds of engravings. Paget himself used to wear a deerstalker hat or fore and aft when he went tramping across the countryside, so it's not surprising that he drew Holmes in the same type of cap, but only when the great man's adventures took him to the country. Similarly, Paget illustrated Holmes on many train journeys in the very practical Inverness cape, which gentlemen of the period wore to protect their finer clothes from railway soot and cinders, as well as from the damp and drafts. Of course, what happened was that Paget's drawings gave readers an indelibly memorable picture of Holmes, and they became the model for countless other artists and actors who presented Holmes in cap and cape no matter where the tenacious detective pursued his villains. There is a worldwide revival of interest in Holmes as a literary character, and it is this interest in the Doyle texts themselves which convinced Britain's Granada Television to film these faithful versions. The transition from print to film often made some very heavy demands on the screenwriters, as did the need to clarify Doyle's obvious inconsistencies and contradictions in many of the very hastily written stories. But the production collaborators were able, without slavishly adhering to every word that the Victorian author wrote, to fashion authentic adaptations of the original stories, as you'll see now in one of the most famous stories, The Adventure of the Dancing Men. Next week, Sherlock Holmes is called into the world of political and military intrigue as he tackles the adventure of the naval treaty. Until then, for Mystery, I'm Vincent Price. Good night.